The oven exploded with a sound like a gunshot, and Elias Doyle felt his heart stop before the flames even reached the ceiling. Smoke rolled across the private kitchen in thick black waves. Trays clattered to the floor. Someone screamed from the hallway outside, and Elias grabbed the nearest towel, beating uselessly at the fire, while sweat poured down his round, red face. He was not supposed to be here. He was not supposed to be anywhere near a kitchen this important. But rent was due, his own shop was drowning in debt, and when the call came asking for an emergency baker for a private dinner, he had said yes before he even asked who the client was. Now he knew, and now his life was about to end because of it. The kitchen belonged to Dante Marchetti, a man whose name alone made grown men lower their voices in restaurants across the city. Elias had heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories. Dante did not forgive mistakes. Dante did not give second chances. And Elias, a heavy-set, overworked baker with flour permanently pressed into the lines of his hands, had just set the man's kitchen on fire during the most important dinner of the year. The main dish, a delicate seafood tart that had taken the head chef 6 hours to prepare, was destroyed, knocked from the counter in the chaos, and now lying in ruins on the tiled floor. Worse than the tart, worse than the fire, worse than any of it, was the table. It had cracked down the middle, a long, dark wood table with carved edges, old and clearly precious, split apart when Elias stumbled backward into it while trying to escape the flames. He heard the wood groan before it broke, and in that single second, he knew he had destroyed something that could never be replaced. The kitchen staff went silent almost immediately, which was somehow worse than the screaming. A young woman with flour-dusted hands stood frozen by the sink, staring at Elias like he had just signed his own death warrant. 2 men near the door exchanged a look and quietly stepped aside, as if putting distance between themselves and Elias before something terrible happened. Then the door swung open. Dante Marchetti stepped into the kitchen slowly, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. He was tall, dressed in a dark gray suit with no wrinkle out of place, his hair combed back, his face unreadable. His eyes moved across the wreckage, the smoke still clearing near the ceiling, the shattered tart on the floor, the broken table. Elias watched him take it all in without a single word, and the silence stretched so long that Elias began to wonder if it would have been kinder for the fire to simply take him too. "Explain," Dante said finally. His voice was calm, almost quiet, which frightened Elias more than shouting would have. "I was trying to move the tray," Elias stammered, his hands shaking so badly he had to press them together to stop them. "The oven, it was old. I didn't know the wiring was. I tried to catch it before it fell, and I hit the table. I'm so sorry. I can pay for." "You cannot pay for this table," Dante said, cutting him off without raising his voice. Elias felt his stomach drop through the floor. Of course he couldn't pay for it. He couldn't even pay his own rent this month. He opened his mouth to apologize again, to say anything that might soften what was coming. But before he could speak, movement near the doorway caught his eye. A girl stood there. She looked to be around 16, thin, dressed simply in a dark sweater, with the same sharp cheekbones and dark eyes as Dante. She must have been drawn by the noise, or maybe she had been watching the whole time from somewhere unseen. She did not gasp at the fire. She did not react to the broken table the way Elias expected a member of this family to react. Instead, she stood very still, her eyes moving slowly around the destroyed kitchen, taking in every detail with a strange, quiet focus. Elias had heard whispers about Dante's daughter. The staff who worked events for the Marchetti family sometimes mentioned her in careful, hushed tones. She had not spoken a single word in years, not since her mother died. Some said it was grief. Some said it was something deeper, something that had broken inside her and never healed. No one seemed to know for certain, and no one dared ask Dante directly. Her name, Elias would later learn, was Vittoria. She stepped further into the kitchen, past her father, past the frozen staff, until she was standing only a few feet from Elias. He held his breath, unsure what to do, unsure if moving would be the wrong choice. Vittoria's eyes moved from his soot-streaked apron to his shaking hands, and then, for a brief second, up to his face. There was no anger in her expression. If anything, there was something closer to curiosity. She tilted her head slightly, studying him the way someone might study an unusual animal that had wandered somewhere it did not belong. "Vittoria," Dante said sharply, and something in his voice changed entirely when he spoke to her, softer, careful, almost pleading. "Go back upstairs." She did not move right away. She looked once more at the broken table, then at Elias, and something flickered across her face that he could not name. It was gone before he could study it further. She turned without a sound and walked out of the kitchen, her footsteps silent against the tile. The moment she was gone, the coldness returned to Dante's face like a curtain falling back into place. "You have destroyed my daughter's mother's table," Dante said quietly. "Do you understand what that means to me?" Elias's throat closed. He did not know the history of the table, did not know what it meant, but he understood enough from the way Dante's jaw tightened to know it meant everything. "I didn't know," Elias whispered. "I would never have." "Get out," Dante said. "Before I decide that fire was not punishment enough." Elias did not need to be told twice. He grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door, nearly tripping over a fallen tray in his hurry, and stumbled out through the service entrance into the cold night air. His hands were still shaking as he half ran, half walked away from the enormous house, the smell of smoke clinging to his clothes, his mind replaying the sound of the table cracking over and over. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the back of his own small shop, staring at the dark ovens, waiting for a knock on the door that never came. Every sound outside made him flinch. Every set of headlights that passed made his chest tighten. But no one came for him that night, or the next. Instead, the punishment arrived quietly, and it was somehow worse than violence. Within a week, Elias noticed his usual flour supplier had suddenly raised prices beyond anything reasonable, then simply stopped delivering altogether, offering no explanation. Then the small catering contracts he depended on to survive began canceling one after another, each client giving a vague excuse about changing plans. His landlord, a heavy-set older man named Peter Lang, who had never once mentioned raising the rent in all the years Elias had leased the shop, suddenly appeared at his door on a Tuesday morning, demanding an increase that Elias could not possibly afford. Peter would not meet his eyes while he spoke, shifting his weight from foot to foot, mumbling something about rising costs and new building fees that made no sense given the state of the crumbling pipes upstairs. Elias asked him directly if someone had spoken to him, if someone had asked him to raise the rent specifically to push Elias out. Peter's silence answered the question more clearly than any words could have. No threats were made. No one touched him. But piece by piece, Elias watched the fragile business he had built with his own 2 hands begin to collapse around him, and he understood exactly whose hand was behind it. He thought about running. He thought about closing the shop and disappearing to another city, starting over somewhere Dante Marchetti's name meant nothing. But the shop had been his father's before him, one of the few things Elias had left of the man, and the thought of abandoning it felt like losing him all over again. The shop itself was small, tucked between a shuttered shoe repair store and a laundromat that never seemed to close. The sign above the door still read, "Doyle's Bakery," in faded gold letters his father had painted himself decades earlier. Elias had grown up in the back room, falling asleep some nights to the smell of rising dough, and though the business had never made him rich, it had always made him feel like he belonged somewhere. Losing it now, piece by quiet piece, felt like watching a slow fire eat through something he loved, no less painful for how patiently it burned. He tried calling his supplier again, a man named Gregory Hale, who had sold him flour and sugar for nearly 8 years without a single problem between them. Gregory did not answer the first 3 times. On the 4th, he picked up only long enough to say, in a voice tight with something that sounded almost like fear, that he could no longer do business with Elias, and that Elias should not call again. The line went dead before Elias could ask why. He understood why. He simply could not do anything about it. His assistant, a patient young woman named Grace who had worked the counter since she was 17, watched the shop's shelves grow emptier each day, and finally asked him directly what was happening. Elias did not have the heart to tell her the truth, that he had ruined the kitchen of one of the most dangerous men in the city, and was now watching his life get dismantled in return. He told her only that supply problems were temporary, that things would sort themselves out soon, though he did not believe it himself even as he said it. So instead, Foolishly, desperately, Elias decided to do the one thing every instinct told him not to do. He decided to go back. He told himself it was to apologize properly, to offer to work for free, to do anything that might convince Dante to stop quietly strangling his business before it died completely. He told himself it had nothing to do with the girl who had looked at him with such strange, quiet curiosity in the middle of the wreckage. He told himself that several times on the long walk across the city, and he did not believe himself even once. The Marchetti family owned a restaurant near the harbor, a place with dark wood interiors and low lighting, always full of well-dressed men who spoke in low voices and never seemed to actually eat their food. Elias had passed it many times before, but had never dared step inside. Now he stood across the street from it in the evening cold, watching the door, trying to gather enough courage to walk through it. It took him nearly 20 minutes to convince his own feet to move. Inside, the restaurant was quieter than he expected, only a handful of tables occupied. A man near the entrance eyed him with obvious suspicion, clearly recognizing him from somewhere, though Elias could not tell if it was a good sign or a very bad one. He kept his head down, mumbling something about needing to speak with Mr. Marchetti, and was told sharply to wait by the bar. He waited nearly an hour. Every time the kitchen doors swung open, his heart lurched, certain Dante himself would appear and end whatever fragile chance he had of fixing things. Men came and went from the back tables, some nodding briefly at the man by the entrance, others avoiding eye contact entirely. Elias tried to make himself as small as possible on his stool at the bar, turning his water glass slowly in his hands, rehearsing apologies in his head that all sounded foolish the moment he imagined saying them aloud. His courage drained a little more with every passing minute, and he was on the verge of simply leaving when he noticed the back booth near the kitchen doors. A girl sat there alone, a sketchbook open in front of her, a pencil moving steadily across the page. It was Vittoria. She had not noticed him yet, fully focused on her drawing, her dark hair falling forward over her shoulder. Elias knew he should look away, should stay exactly where he had been told to wait, but something about the quiet concentration on her face held his attention. There was no bodyguard standing over her, no staff member watching closely. She looked, for a moment, like any ordinary girl sitting alone with her thoughts. He must have shifted his weight or made some small sound, because her eyes lifted suddenly and found his across the room. Elias froze, certain he was about to be in serious trouble for staring, but Vittoria did not call out, did not react with alarm. She studied him for a long moment, the same careful, curious look from the kitchen returning to her face, and then, very slowly, she closed her sketchbook and looked back down at the table in front of her. It was not an invitation exactly, but it was not a dismissal either. Elias stood rooted to the spot, unsure what to do with the strange, fragile moment stretching between them, when the man from the entrance appeared beside him again, his expression hard. "Mr. Marchetti isn't seeing anyone tonight," the man said flatly. "You need to leave." Elias glanced once more toward the booth, but Vittoria had already lowered her eyes back to her sketchbook, as though the moment between them had never happened at all. He nodded quickly, apologized under his breath, and let himself be walked back out into the cold night. As the restaurant door swung shut behind him, Elias stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, his heart still pounding, though not entirely from fear this time. He thought about the way she had looked at him, not with disgust or judgment, but with something closer to quiet interest, the way someone studies a puzzle they have not yet decided whether they want to solve. He had gone to that restaurant to save his business. He was leaving with his business no closer to being saved, his fear of Dante Marchetti no smaller, and yet something inside him had shifted anyway, something he could not name, and was not sure he wanted to examine too closely. He walked home slowly that night, taking the long way through streets he did not usually bother with, replaying the moment again and again. A girl who had not spoken in years, surrounded by men who feared her father, sitting alone with a sketchbook, as though the world outside her booth did not exist. There had been nothing dramatic in the way she looked at him, no fear, no judgment, nothing close to the reactions he had grown used to receiving from people who knew what he had done, just a quiet, steady attention, as if she were the only person in that entire restaurant who had actually seen him. By the time Elias reached his own dark shop and let himself in through the back door, The fear that had gripped him for days had not disappeared, but it had changed shape somehow, settled into something quieter, something he could carry a little more easily. He sat at his father's old work table, long after midnight, staring at the empty flour bins lining the far wall, and for the first time since the fire, he allowed himself to wonder if there might be a way through this after all. He did not know yet what that way looked like. He did not know that the girl with the sketchbook would become the reason he kept fighting instead of running, or that the very kitchen he had destroyed would somehow, impossibly, become tied to his future in ways he could not yet imagine. He only knew, sitting there in the dark with the smell of old flour still clinging faintly to the walls, that whatever came next, he was not ready to give up. Whatever it was, he had the strong, uneasy feeling that this was only the beginning. The knock on the shop door came at midnight, sharp and deliberate, and Elias nearly dropped the tray he was carrying. He had been awake for hours, unable to sleep, going through the motions of cleaning an already spotless kitchen just to keep his hands busy. When the knock came a second time, harder than the first, he crossed the dark shop with his heart hammering against his ribs, certain that Dante had finally sent someone to finish what the fire had started. He opened the door to find a man he did not recognize, broad-shouldered, dressed in a plain dark coat, his face calm in a way that made Elias's stomach twist. The man did not step inside. He simply held out a folded piece of paper and waited until Elias took it with shaking hands. "You have a debt," the man said. "Mr. Marchetti has decided how you will pay it." Then he turned and walked away into the night without another word, leaving Elias standing alone in his doorway, with the paper trembling between his fingers. Inside, under the dim light above the counter, Elias unfolded it slowly. The words were brief, typed rather than handwritten, as though even the act of writing to him personally was beneath consideration. He was to report to the Marchetti estate the following evening. He was to bring nothing but his hands and his skills. Failure to appear would result in consequences the letter did not bother to describe, though Elias's imagination filled in the details easily enough. He read it 3 times before the meaning settled fully into his chest. Dante was not going to destroy him outright. Dante was going to make him work. Relief and dread arrived together, tangled so tightly he could not separate one from the other. Whatever this arrangement turned out to be, it meant he was still alive, still breathing, still standing in his father's shop instead of lying somewhere he would never be found. But it also meant walking back into that house, back into that kitchen, back toward the man whose family he had wronged in ways he still did not fully understand. He did not sleep that night either. The following evening, Elias arrived at the Marchetti estate, exactly on time, dressed in his cleanest apron, his hands scrubbed raw from nervous washing. The same man who had delivered the letter met him at the service entrance and led him through the halls without a word, past paintings that looked older than the city itself, past closed doors he did not dare glance toward. The kitchen had been repaired, the scorch marks on the ceiling were gone, painted over so completely that no evidence of the fire remained. New equipment gleamed under bright overhead lights, and Elias felt a fresh wave of shame at how easily his disaster had been erased, as if it had never happened at all, as if the damage he had caused mattered so little to a man like Dante that it could simply be painted away. The broken table, he noticed with a small ache in his chest, was gone entirely. He did not ask what had happened to it. He suspected he already knew, and he suspected the answer would only make him feel worse. Dante appeared a few minutes later, flanked by 2 members of his staff, his expression as unreadable as it had been the night of the fire. He looked Elias over slowly, the way someone might examine a tool they were unsure would be useful. "You will work here," Dante said, "under supervision, for every family event, until your debt is repaid. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not wander this house. You will not go near my daughter." Elias nodded quickly, not trusting his voice. "Do you understand?" Dante pressed, his tone sharpening. "Yes," Elias managed. "I understand completely." Dante studied him a moment longer, as though searching for some sign of defiance he could punish immediately, then turned and left without another word, leaving Elias alone with the kitchen staff who had witnessed his disaster only weeks earlier. None of them spoke to him directly, though he caught a few curious glances as he was handed an apron, and shown to a station near the back wall, as far from the main preparation area as possible. That first night, he baked for a small family gathering, nothing as elaborate as the dinner that had gone so disastrously wrong before. He worked in near silence, following instructions from the head chef, a stern woman named Colleen, who watched his every movement with obvious suspicion, as though she expected him to set the kitchen ablaze again at any moment. Elias understood the caution. He would have watched himself just as closely. He did not see Vittoria that night, though he found himself glancing toward the kitchen doors more than once, half hoping, half dreading that she might appear the way she had before. The pattern continued over the following weeks. Elias would receive word of an upcoming event, arrive at the estate exactly on time, work in careful silence under Colleen's watchful eye, and leave without incident. Slowly, painfully, the debt that had been swallowing his life began to shrink, though Dante never once acknowledged the progress directly. Elias existed, during those hours in the kitchen, as something closer to a piece of equipment than a person, useful only for what he could produce. Colleen, despite her early suspicion, softened toward him gradually as the weeks passed. She was not a warm woman by nature, quick and sharp in her instructions, impatient with mistakes. But she noticed things about Elias that seemed to shift her opinion little by little. He arrived early every time, without exception. He cleaned his station more thoroughly than anyone had asked him to. He never once complained about the smallest, most tedious tasks he was given, peeling mountains of fruit or scrubbing pans long after everyone else had gone home for the night. One evening, after he had spent an hour perfecting a batch of small pastries no one outside the kitchen would likely even notice, Colleen tasted one, said nothing for a long moment, and then simply nodded once before walking away. It was the closest thing to praise he had received since the fire, and it meant more to him than he expected. His own shop, meanwhile, remained in a fragile kind of limbo. Grace kept the doors open with whatever small local business still trickled in, though the shelves stayed thinner than they had ever been. Elias spent his mornings there before heading to the estate each evening, mixing what dough he could afford with the ingredients he still had access to, determined not to let his father's shop close completely while he worked to repay a debt that had nothing to do with the business itself. It was an exhausting way to live, stretched thin between two kitchens, two lives, but it was survivable, and survivable was more than he had believed possible during those first terrible days after the fire. It was on the fourth week that he saw Vittoria again. He had been sent to gather supplies from a storage room near the back staircase, a task usually given to junior staff, though Colleen seemed to enjoy assigning it to Elias specifically. He was halfway through counting sacks of flour when he heard the faint scratch of a pencil against paper somewhere nearby. Vittoria sat on the bottom step of the staircase, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, completely absorbed in whatever she was drawing. She must have heard him enter, but she did not look up right away, her pencil moving in steady, confident strokes. Elias froze, remembering Dante's warning clearly. He was not supposed to go near her. He should have turned around immediately, gathered his supplies from elsewhere, pretended he had never seen her at all. Instead, he found himself standing very still, unwilling to disturb whatever quiet world she seemed to be lost inside. After a long moment, Vittoria's eyes lifted to meet his. Neither of them spoke. Elias remembered too clearly that she did not speak at all, and he was suddenly unsure whether it would be rude or simply pointless to say anything himself. But her expression held none of the caution he expected. If anything, there was a faint curiosity there again, the same quiet attention from the restaurant weeks earlier. She turned her sketchbook slightly, just enough for him to see the page. It was a drawing of the kitchen fire. Not a cruel drawing, not mocking, but oddly gentle, almost funny in the way she had captured it, flames curling upward in exaggerated shapes, Elias himself drawn mid-panic with wide eyes, and flour scattered across his apron like snow. It should have embarrassed him further. Instead, seeing his worst moment turned into something almost playful, loosened something tight in his chest that had not eased in weeks. Elias studied the drawing longer than he meant to, noticing small details he had not expected, the way she had drawn the broken table with something close to tenderness rather than damage, the way his own panicked expression had been softened into something almost comical rather than pathetic. It was clear, looking at the careful lines, that she had spent real time on it, more time than a passing glance at chaos would have required. Someone who wanted only to mock him would not have bothered with such care. A small, surprised laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Vittoria's lips curved, not quite a smile, but close enough that Elias felt an unexpected warmth spread through him. She closed the sketchbook and, without a word, tore the page free along its perforated edge, holding it out toward him. He hesitated only a moment before taking it, careful not to crease the paper. "Thank you," he said quietly, unsure if the words meant anything to her, unsure if she wanted them at all. She did not respond, but she did not look away either, and the two of them stood there in the narrow stairwell for several long, silent seconds, something unspoken passing between them that Elias could not have explained if he tried. Footsteps sounded from above, and Vittoria's expression shifted instantly, alert, in a way that told Elias she had heard the change in the house before he had. She rose quickly, tucking her sketchbook against her chest, and disappeared up the staircase without a backward glance, leaving Elias alone with the drawing still held carefully in his hands. He barely had time to fold it into his apron pocket before Dante himself appeared at the top of the stairs, his eyes narrowing the moment he spotted Elias standing where he should not have been. "What are you doing here?" Dante demanded, descending the steps with slow, deliberate menace. "Supplies," Elias said quickly, gesturing toward the storage room. "Colleen sent me for flour." Dante's eyes flicked toward the storage room, then back to Elias, searching for some crack in the explanation. Whatever he was looking for, he did not find it, though the suspicion in his expression did not fully fade. "My daughter was here," Dante said, not quite a question. Elias's mouth went dry. Lying to this man seemed like the fastest way to end up somewhere far worse than a struggling bakery. "She was on the stairs when I came for the flour," he admitted carefully. "She didn't say anything. I didn't approach her." It was not entirely a lie, though it was not entirely the truth either. Dante studied him for a long, uncomfortable moment, and Elias forced himself to hold perfectly still, resisting the urge to reach toward the pocket where the drawing was hidden, certain that any sudden movement would give him away completely. He kept his eyes fixed somewhere near Dante's collar, not quite meeting his gaze, not quite looking away either. The way he had learned over the past weeks was the safest posture to hold in this man's presence. His pulse pounded so loudly in his own ears that he wondered, absurdly, whether Dante could somehow hear it too. There was something different in Dante's expression this time, something beyond the usual cold suspicion. For just a moment, before the mask settled back into place, Elias thought he glimpsed something closer to fear, the particular fear of a father who had already lost one person he loved, and could not bear the thought of losing another, even to something as small and strange as a stranger standing near a staircase. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced again by the flat, warning stare Elias had come to expect. "Remember what I told you," Dante finally said, his voice low. "This is not a warning I will give twice." Elias nodded, and Dante turned without another word, climbing back up the staircase and disappearing into the house above. Only once he was gone did Elias allow himself to breathe fully again. He gathered the flour sacks with trembling hands, his mind replaying the strange, quiet exchange with Vittoria over and over, the drawing still folded safely against his chest as he made his way back toward the kitchen. He knew he should stay away from her entirely. He knew that whatever fragile understanding had passed between them in that narrow stairwell was exactly the kind of thing that could destroy the fragile peace he had managed to build with Dante. Every instinct told him to forget the drawing, forget the moment, focus only on repaying his debt and disappearing from this family's life forever once it was done. But walking back through the long, silent halls of the Marchetti estate, the folded paper pressed against his chest like something precious, Elias found himself thinking not of the danger he had just avoided, but of the small, almost smile that had crossed Vittoria's face in the stairwell, and wondering, despite every warning bell sounding in his mind, when he might see it again. That night, after finishing his work and walking the long way home through empty streets, Elias unfolded the drawing once more, under the weak light of his own kitchen. He studied it for a long while, tracing the pencil lines with his eyes, before carefully tucking it into the drawer beneath his father's old recipe box, a place he kept only the things that mattered most to him. He told himself it was simply a kind gesture from a lonely girl, with few people who looked at her without fear or pity. Nothing more complicated than that. But lying awake later that night, staring at the cracked ceiling above his bed, he found his thoughts returning again and again to the stairwell, to the quiet understanding that had passed between them without a single word spoken. He thought of how easily she could have ignored him entirely, how easily she could have said nothing, done nothing, let him leave with his shame intact. Instead, she had chosen, in her own silent way, to reach toward him. He did not know what that meant. He was not sure it was safe to find out. But some quiet, stubborn part of him had already decided that the next time their paths crossed, he would not simply walk away, whatever warning Dante had given him, whatever danger it might invite. For the first time since the fire had turned his life upside down, Elias fell asleep without dreading what the morning might bring. The pastry sat untouched on the tray for 3 full days before anyone noticed it had been shaped like a small, crooked bird. Elias had made it on impulse, late one night after finishing his official duties in the estate kitchen, using scraps of dough he would have otherwise thrown away. He shaped it carefully, working the edges into rough feathers, and left it on a plate near the staff entrance, in a spot he knew Vittoria sometimes passed on her way to the garden. He told himself it meant nothing, that it was simply a way to avoid wasting good dough. He did not entirely believe himself, but it was easier than admitting the truth out loud, even inside his own head. Colleen noticed the pastry the following morning, raising an eyebrow at the strange little shape, but saying nothing, as though she understood. There was a reason behind it she did not need explained. By the 3rd day, the pastry had disappeared from the plate, and in its place sat a small folded piece of paper, the corner torn from a familiar sketchbook. Elias unfolded it carefully in a quiet corner of the kitchen, his heart beating faster than the moment deserved. There was no writing on it, only a drawing, simple and quick, of a bird with slightly crooked wings, standing on 2 feet instead of flying, looking oddly determined despite its awkward shape. Elias stared at it for a long moment before understanding settled over him, warm and unexpected. She had seen his small, foolish gift. She had understood exactly what it was. He kept the drawing folded in his apron pocket for the rest of the night, and though he did not see her again that evening, the quiet exchange stayed with him long after he had returned home. Over the following weeks, the small gestures became a pattern neither of them spoke about openly, careful, and quiet enough to avoid drawing attention from the rest of the household. Elias left little things where he knew she would find them: a pastry shaped like a cat curled in sleep, a sugared lemon twisted into the shape of a star, a note that asked nothing of her and required no answer, only stating that the kitchen felt less lonely on the nights he thought she might be somewhere nearby. In return, small drawings began appearing in unexpected places, tucked beneath a folded towel, slipped beneath the edge of a cutting board, always simple, always quick, as though she wanted to leave a trace of herself, without risking too much in the process. Each new drawing became something Elias looked forward to with an eagerness he tried, unsuccessfully, to talk himself out of. There was a sketch of the kitchen ovens drawn with strange, exaggerated warmth, little curls of steam rising like smiling faces. There was a drawing of Colleen mid-scold, her finger pointed sternly at some unseen mistake, somehow both accurate and affectionate at once. There was even, on one memorable evening, a small sketch of Elias himself, hunched over a mixing bowl with fierce concentration, his tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth, the way it apparently did whenever he focused hard on his work. He had laughed out loud when he found that one, quickly covering his mouth for fear of drawing attention, though the warmth of it stayed with him for days afterward. He began keeping every drawing in the same drawer beneath his father's recipe box, the small collection growing steadily, page by page, until it had become something he could not imagine his life without. He never mentioned the drawer to anyone, not even Grace, though he suspected she noticed the change in him regardless, the way he hummed quietly while working some mornings, the way his eyes drifted occasionally toward the window, as though waiting for something he could not name. Elias began to notice things about the household during those weeks that he had been too frightened to see clearly before. He noticed the way staff members spoke around Vittoria, rather than to her, discussing her schedule, her meals, her health, as though she were an object to be managed, rather than a person capable of hearing every word. He noticed how quickly conversations died the moment she entered a room, how carefully everyone avoided asking her opinion on anything, assuming her silence meant she had nothing worth saying. He noticed, too, the exhaustion that sometimes crossed Dante's face when he thought no one was watching, a tiredness that went far beyond the demands of running his business, something heavier and older, rooted in grief that had never fully healed. Dante's control over every detail of his daughter's life, Elias began to realize, was not born from cruelty exactly, but from a fear so deep it had calcified into something that looked like cruelty from the outside. He had already lost the woman he loved. He seemed determined never to lose the daughter who remained, even if that determination meant smothering the very person he was trying to protect. One of the older kitchen staff, a soft-spoken man named Peter who had worked for the family for over 20 years, mentioned once, almost by accident, that Dante had personally chosen every doctor, every tutor, every household member who came near Vittoria since her mother's passing, interviewing each one himself, dismissing anyone he felt asked too many questions or pushed too hard for progress he was not ready to see. It struck Elias hearing this, that Dante had built a fortress around his daughter so complete that even the people meant to help her had learned to tread carefully around the edges of her silence, rather than gently inside it. No one had been given the room to simply sit with her, to let her set the pace of her own healing. Everyone around her had been managing a problem instead of knowing a person. Elias thought often, during those quiet weeks, about how strange it was that his own disaster, the fire, the broken table, the debt that had nearly destroyed his shop, had somehow placed him in exactly the position no one else in this house occupied. He was not hired to fix Vittoria. He was not paid to manage her. He was simply present, working quietly in a corner of the kitchen, asking nothing of her at all, and perhaps that was precisely why she had chosen, in her own quiet way, to reach toward him first. Vittoria, for her part, seemed to notice everything, storing it all away in the careful, watchful silence she carried through the house. Elias began to understand, slowly, that her silence was not emptiness. It was a kind of armor, built over years of being spoken over, managed, protected into a corner too small for her to grow inside. One evening, arriving earlier than usual for a scheduled dinner event, Elias found her sitting alone in the garden behind the kitchen, her sketchbook resting closed on her lap, staring out at nothing in particular. He hesitated at the doorway, remembering every warning Dante had given him, but something in the stillness of her posture made him step outside anyway, careful to keep a respectful distance. She glanced up at him, and though she did not smile, there was no alarm in her expression either, only the same quiet acknowledgement that had become familiar between them. "I made too many of the almond pastries again," Elias said, holding out a small paper bag he had brought with him, more out of habit now than necessity. "I thought you might want some, if you're hungry." Vittoria studied him for a long moment, before reaching out to take the bag, her fingers brushing briefly against his. It was such a small thing, barely a touch at all, but Elias felt it settle somewhere deep in his chest, warm and unfamiliar. She opened the bag, examined the pastries inside, and then reached for the pencil tucked behind her ear, flipping open her sketchbook to a blank page. She wrote quickly, her handwriting neat and careful, and turned the book toward him. "You don't have to keep doing this," the note read. "I know my father scares you." Elias read the words twice, surprised by the simple honesty of them. He considered his answer carefully before speaking. "He does scare me," he admitted, "but that's not why I keep doing it." Vittoria's eyes lifted to his, waiting. "I don't know exactly why," Elias continued, feeling foolish and honest all at once. "I think it's because you're the first person in a long time who's looked at me without expecting anything back. Even before the fire, before any of this, people mostly looked at me and saw someone useful, or someone to laugh at, never anyone else. You just look at me like I'm a person. That matters more than I expected it to." Vittoria was still for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before she wrote again beneath her first note. "No one has ever said that to me before either." She hesitated, pencil hovering above the page, before adding another line beneath it, her handwriting slightly less steady this time. "Everyone here treats me like something breakable. My father most of all. Sometimes I think he forgot I am still here, not just the part of me that got hurt." Elias read the words slowly, feeling the weight of them settle over the quiet garden. He thought of Dante's tired eyes, the careful way the whole household moved around this girl, as though she might shatter at the wrong word, and he understood, suddenly, that the kindness everyone believed they were offering her had become its own kind of cage. "I don't think you're breakable," he said quietly. "I think you're one of the strongest people I've met, actually. Anyone who could carry all of this silently, for years, and still find a way to draw something beautiful out of it, that's not fragile. That's something else entirely." A faint flush colored Vittoria's cheeks, and she looked down at her sketchbook, tracing the edge of the page with her thumb, as though she needed a moment to hold what he had said before she could look at him again. Elias felt something shift between them in that quiet garden, fragile and new, something neither of them dared to name aloud. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, Vittoria eating one of the pastries slowly, Elias watching the evening light fade behind the garden wall, both of them aware, without needing to say it, that whatever this was becoming carried real danger for them both. It was Colleen who eventually called him back inside for the evening's work, her sharp voice cutting through the quiet garden and startling them both. Vittoria closed her sketchbook quickly, tucking it against her chest, and offered him one last glance before slipping back into the house through a side door Elias had never noticed before. He returned to the kitchen with his heart still unsettled, grateful for the demanding work ahead of him, something to occupy his hands and quiet the racing thoughts in his head. Colleen watched him closely as he worked that evening, saying nothing directly, though once, while passing behind him to check a tray in the oven, she murmured quietly enough that only he could hear. "Be careful," she said. "Whatever this is." Elias did not ask her what she meant. He did not need to. He simply nodded once, understanding fully the risk he was choosing to carry, and returned his attention to the dough in front of him, his hands steady despite everything churning beneath the surface. The weeks that followed brought their own quiet rhythm. Elias's debt continued shrinking with each event he worked, though Dante's suspicion toward him never fully faded, sharp eyes tracking him whenever their paths crossed in the halls. Elias grew more careful in turn, ensuring his small exchanges with Vittoria happened only in moments he was certain would go unnoticed, though the risk of discovery hung over every interaction like a blade waiting to fall. He learned things about her slowly, pieced together from careful notes and quiet afternoons in the garden. She had loved to sing once, before her mother died, though she had not tried in years, uncertain her voice still worked the way it used to. She missed her mother's laugh more than any specific memory, the sound of it rather than any particular moment attached to it. She drew because it was the one part of herself no one could take away or manage on her behalf, the one language that remained entirely her own. Elias found himself sharing pieces of his own life in return, stories about his father teaching him to shape dough as a boy, standing on a wooden stool just to reach the counter, flour dusted through his hair like snow. He told her about the quiet loneliness of running a shop that barely stayed afloat, the long nights spent alone after his father passed, wondering if he was strong enough to keep the business standing on his own. He told her about the strange, unexpected relief of finally having someone who listened without judgment, even if that someone could not answer him with words, and how that relief had crept up on him slowly, without him even noticing, until it had already become something he depended on. Vittoria listened to every story with the same careful attention she gave to her drawings, occasionally jotting a quick question in her sketchbook, wanting to know what his father's bread tasted like, whether he still used the same recipes, whether the shop still smelled the way it had when he was a boy. Her questions were small, simple things, but they carried a hunger behind them that told Elias she had spent far too long being asked nothing at all, her own curiosity treated as something to be managed rather than encouraged. He began looking forward to these stolen moments more than he wanted to admit, structuring his days around the small chance he might catch even a few minutes with her, whether in the garden or the quiet stairwell, or the narrow hallway near the pantry where she sometimes waited with a folded note tucked into her sleeve. It was reckless. He knew it was reckless. And yet each time he saw her sketchbook open and waiting, some anxious, tightly wound part of him finally eased, if only for the length of their brief and careful conversation. It was during one of these quiet exchanges, weeks into their careful friendship, that Vittoria wrote something that stayed with Elias long after he left the estate that night. "I think I want to try speaking again. I don't know how yet." Elias read the words several times, feeling the weight of what she was trusting him with settle heavily and warmly in his chest all at once. "Whenever you're ready," he said quietly. "There's no rush. I'll still be here." She looked at him for a long moment, something unguarded crossing her face, before she carefully hid it away again, and nodded once, a small, private agreement between them that neither of them spoke of again that night. Neither of them noticed, in the fading evening light, the figure standing motionless near the far end of the garden wall, watching them both with an expression that had gone very still, very quiet, and very dangerous. The trouble had been building for days, though Elias had not realized how closely he and Vittoria were being watched until it was already too late. A rival family, led by a man named Gregory Voss, had begun making quiet moves against the Marchetti business over the past month, testing old alliances, poaching a handful of longtime associates, spreading rumors through the city that Dante's grip on his territory had weakened since his wife's death. Dante had grown sharper and more watchful because of it, his patience thinner than usual, his staff walking on eggshells around him at every turn. Elias had noticed the tension without fully understanding its cause, only aware that Colleen had begun double-checking every detail of every event, with far more urgency than before, and that extra men now stood posted near the estate's gates at all hours. It was in the middle of this tension that one of the household guards, a broad man who rarely spoke, happened to glimpse Elias and Vittoria together, near the garden wall one evening, their heads bent close over her sketchbook, her lips moving in the halting shape of unfamiliar words. The guard said nothing to either of them. He simply reported what he had seen to Dante the following morning, and by that evening, the fragile secret Elias and Vittoria had protected for weeks had unraveled entirely. Dante's hand slammed against the kitchen counter hard enough to rattle every pan hanging above it, and the entire staff froze where they stood. "Explain to me," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "why my daughter has been spending time with the man who destroyed my kitchen." Elias stood rigid near his station, flour still dusting his hands, his heart pounding so hard he was certain everyone in the room could hear it. He had known, somewhere in the back of his mind, that this moment might come. He had simply hoped, foolishly, that it would not come so soon, or so suddenly, or with Dante's eyes fixed so directly on his own. "Sir, I did not ask you to speak," Dante snapped, cutting him off with a sharpness that silenced Elias immediately. The kitchen had gone utterly still. Colleen stood near the stove, her expression carefully blank, though Elias caught the faint tightening around her eyes that told him she was worried. Worried for him, worried for what was about to happen. The other staff kept their gazes fixed on their own work, none of them daring to look up, all of them clearly grateful it was not their name Dante had spoken with such fury. Dante crossed the kitchen slowly, each step deliberate, until he stood directly in front of Elias, close enough that Elias could see the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, exhaustion that had nothing to do with the late hour, and everything to do with years of grief he had never allowed himself to fully release. "I warned you," Dante said, his voice low now, almost dangerously calm. "I told you to stay away from her." "I know," Elias said quietly, refusing to look away despite every instinct screaming at him to lower his eyes. "I couldn't." Something flickered across Dante's face, surprise perhaps, or fury barely contained beneath the surface. "You couldn't," he repeated flatly. "She's not what everyone in this house treats her as," Elias said, the words rushing out before he could stop them, driven by something braver than he felt. "She's not fragile, she's not broken, she's smart, and funny, and she sees things no one else in this house bothers to see. I never went looking for trouble with her. I just couldn't make myself stay away once I understood what she actually is, instead of what everyone assumes." For a long, terrible moment, Elias was certain he had said too much. Certain the next sound he heard would be Dante calling for the men waiting just beyond the kitchen doors. Instead, Dante's jaw tightened, and something raw and unguarded passed briefly across his face before he could smooth it back into anger. "You know nothing about what she is," Dante said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier fury. replaced by something closer to weariness. You know nothing about what I lost, what I am trying to protect her from. Then tell me, Elias said, surprising himself with his own boldness. Because from where I've been standing, it looks like protecting her has become the same thing as locking her away. She hasn't spoken in years, and I don't think that's only grief anymore. I think somewhere along the way, this house taught her that silence was safer than being seen. Dante's hand curled into a fist at his side, and for a moment, Elias braced himself for violence, but the blow never came. Instead, Dante simply turned away, his shoulders dropping slightly, the fury draining out of him and leaving something far more exposed behind. Get out, Dante said quietly, without the heat of before. Finish tonight's work, then go home. I will decide what happens next. Elias did not argue. He finished the evening's baking in a fog, his hands moving through familiar motions, while his mind raced through every possible outcome, none of them good. He did not see Vittoria again that night, and he left the estate with a heaviness in his chest that followed him all the way home. He did not sleep. He sat awake at his father's old work table, staring at nothing, waiting for a message that would tell him whether his debt, his freedom, his fragile connection to Vittoria had all just been destroyed in a single furious conversation. The days that followed were some of the longest of his life. Grace noticed his distraction at the shop, the way his hands moved through familiar tasks without his mind fully present, the way he flinched every time the front bell rang, certain each customer might instead be one of Dante's men arriving to deliver whatever punishment had finally been decided. He barely ate. He barely slept more than an hour or two at a stretch, jolting awake at every sound from the street outside, his mind cycling endlessly through every version of what might happen next, from quiet dismissal to something far more permanent. He thought, more than once, about simply disappearing, taking what little money he had, and leaving the city entirely, before Dante could decide his fate for him. But every time the thought surfaced, he found himself picturing Vittoria's face in the garden, the careful hope in her expression as she showed him her drawings, and he could not make himself take a single step toward the door. Whatever happened next, he owed it to her, and to himself, to face it rather than run from it, even if facing it meant facing the end of everything. The message did not come that night, or the next day. The silence stretched on for nearly a week, unbearable in its uncertainty, until finally, a folded note arrived at his shop, delivered by a young boy who refused to say who had sent him, before running off down the street. Elias unfolded it with trembling hands, expecting the worst. Instead, he found Vittoria's familiar, careful handwriting. Come to the garden tonight. My father knows. Something has changed. He arrived at the estate that evening, uncertain what to expect, half convinced he was walking directly into a trap. The guard at the gate said nothing as he passed, simply nodding him through with an expression Elias could not read, and every step down the familiar path toward the kitchen felt heavier than the last, his mind bracing for some final confrontation he could not yet see coming. Instead, he found Vittoria waiting for him in the garden alone, her expression a mixture of nervousness and something that looked almost like hope. She held up her sketchbook before he could speak, showing him a page filled not with a drawing, but with careful, deliberate handwriting, longer than anything she had ever written to him before. I finally told my father everything, not on paper. I tried to speak it, out loud, for the first time in years. It came out broken and quiet, but it came out. I told him I was tired of being protected into silence. I told him that watching him control every part of my life since my mother died had not saved me from grief. It had only added loneliness on top of it. I told him about you, that you were the only person who had ever simply let me be myself without trying to fix me. Elias read the words twice, his chest tight with something he could not fully name. Pride and disbelief, and a fragile, cautious hope, all tangled together. You spoke, he said softly, out loud. Vittoria nodded, her eyes bright, and for the first time since he had known her, she opened her mouth and spoke aloud to him directly, her voice rough and unpracticed, barely above a whisper. I spoke, she said. The words trembled slightly, uncertain after years of disuse, but they were unmistakably real. Elias felt something break open in his chest, warm and overwhelming, and he had to fight the sudden urge to reach for her hand, uncertain if such a gesture would be welcome, uncertain of anything except the fierce, protective joy rising inside him at the sound of her voice. "How did your father take it?" he asked carefully. Vittoria's expression sobered slightly. "He didn't say much," she admitted, her voice still quiet, still finding its footing after so long unused. "He looked like I had struck him. I think he never realized how much his fear had shaped my whole life. I think he believed he was protecting me, and maybe some of it was protection, but some of it was also him trying to control the only piece of my mother he had left." Elias nodded slowly, thinking of the exhaustion he had seen carved into Dante's face, the grief that had calcified into something that looked like control from the outside, exactly as he had suspected weeks earlier. "What happens now?" he asked. "I don't know," Vittoria admitted, "but I told him I wanted to keep speaking, keep drawing, keep seeing you, if you still wanted to see me. I told him it wasn't his decision to make anymore, not entirely. He needs time, I think. For the first time, he's actually listening." They sat together in the quiet garden for a long while after that, the tension of the past week slowly loosening between them, replaced by something fragile but real, a future that suddenly seemed possible in a way it had not before. It was nearly 2 hours later, as Elias prepared to leave for the night, that he found Dante waiting for him near the estate's main gate, standing alone in the darkness, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Elias stopped several feet away, unsure what to expect, his heart pounding once again. "She spoke to me tonight," Dante said quietly, not quite looking at Elias directly. "For the first time in 2 years. Do you understand what that means to me?" "I think I'm beginning to," Elias said carefully. Dante was silent for a long moment, staring out at the dark grounds beyond the gate. "I have spent 2 years believing that if I controlled everything around her closely enough, nothing could ever hurt her again," he said finally, his voice heavy with something Elias had never heard from him before, something close to regret. "I did not realize I had become the thing hurting her instead." Elias did not know what to say, so he said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch between them without trying to fill it. "I am not thanking you," Dante said sharply, some of his usual hardness returning to his voice. "Do not mistake this for approval. I still do not know what to make of whatever this is between you and my daughter, but I am not blind to what happened tonight, and I am not foolish enough to ignore it." "I understand," Elias said quietly. Dante studied him for a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes, before speaking again. "Your debt," he said. "It is nearly repaid. A few more weeks, perhaps a month. After that, you will have no further obligation to this family." Elias's stomach tightened, uncertain whether this meant an ending or something else entirely. "And after that?" he asked carefully. "After that," Dante said, turning to walk back toward the house, "we will see what my daughter decides she wants. It will not be my decision alone anymore. It seems that lesson has finally been made clear to me tonight." He disappeared back through the gate without another word, leaving Elias standing alone in the cool night air, his mind spinning with everything that had just shifted beneath his feet. He thought of Vittoria's voice, rough and trembling and undeniably real, breaking through years of silence. He thought of the fragile, uncertain hope in Dante's eyes, a father beginning, however slowly, to loosen a grip he had held out of love twisted into fear. Walking home through the quiet streets that night, Elias allowed himself, for the first time since the disastrous fire that had started all of this, to imagine a future that did not end in ruin. He did not know exactly what that future looked like yet, whether it involved the estate at all, whether Dante's fragile tolerance would hold or crumble under its own weight. But for the first time in months, the fear that had gripped him constantly since that first terrible night had eased into something quieter, something that almost resembled hope. He reached into his pocket without thinking, and found, tucked carefully inside, the very first drawing Vittoria had ever given him, the crooked little bird, standing determined on 2 feet instead of flying. He smiled faintly in the darkness, understanding suddenly and completely why she had drawn it exactly that way. Some things did not need wings to move forward. They only needed the courage to take the first uncertain step. Behind him, the estate settled into its usual nighttime quiet, guards shifting at their posts, windows dimming one by one as the household prepared for sleep. Somewhere inside, Elias knew, Vittoria was likely sitting with her sketchbook, perhaps drawing the events of the evening the way she drew everything that mattered to her, capturing in quiet lines what words still did not always come easily. He wondered if she would draw her father's face as he had looked, walking away from the gate, tired and uncertain, and, for the first time in years, honestly searching for a better way forward. He wondered, too, what Gregory Voss and his rivals would make of the sudden shift inside the Marchetti household, whether the whispers of weakness circling the family for weeks would grow louder now, sensing division where there had once been only Dante's iron control. Elias did not know enough about that world to guess how dangerous the coming weeks might become, but he understood, walking away from the estate that night, that whatever storm was gathering on the horizon, he no longer intended to face it from the outside looking in. For the first time since the fire had turned his life upside down, Elias felt something steadier than fear settle into his chest, something that felt dangerously, wonderfully close to belonging. Smoke curled from the small oven in the corner of the bakery, but this time, nobody screamed. Elias laughed instead, waving a towel lazily at the harmless puff of smoke rising from a batch of cookies he had left in too long on purpose, a private joke that had become tradition between him and the one customer who always arrived at exactly this hour, expecting exactly this kind of chaos. "You did that on purpose again," came a voice from the doorway, warm with familiar amusement. 2 years had passed since the night Elias walked away from the Marchetti estate, uncertain of what waited ahead, and the voice that greeted him now belonged to someone entirely transformed from the silent, watchful girl he had first met in the wreckage of a disastrous dinner. Vittoria stood in the doorway of his small, newly rebuilt bakery, her sketchbook tucked under one arm as always, though these days it shared space with a growing collection of finished paintings that had begun attracting quiet attention around the city. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Elias said, grinning as he pulled the slightly overdone cookies from the oven and set them on the counter between them. "These are perfectly fine." "They're burnt," Vittoria said, laughing, the sound easy and unguarded now, nothing like the rough, uncertain whisper it had been the first time she spoke aloud in the garden 2 years earlier. "You burn something every single time I visit. I've started to think it's the only way you know how to say hello." "Maybe it is," Elias said, shrugging with mock innocence. "Works every time, doesn't it? You're still here." She rolled her eyes, though the smile did not leave her face as she settled onto the stool behind the counter, the same stool she had claimed as her own, months earlier, during the long, difficult process of rebuilding what the fire and the debt had nearly destroyed completely. The bakery itself looked nothing like the struggling shop Elias had inherited from his father, though it still carried the same faded gold sign above the door, restored now rather than replaced. A small, stubborn piece of history he had refused to let go of, even as everything else around it changed. New shelves lined the walls, filled with bread and pastries that drew a steady stream of customers throughout the day. A small corner near the window held a handful of Vittoria's paintings, framed simply, offered for sale to anyone who admired them, a quiet collaboration between the two of them that neither had planned, but both had come to treasure. The road to this point had not been easy. Dante's grudging tolerance in the weeks following that difficult night in the garden had grown slowly into something more substantial, though never entirely comfortable. He had insisted on personally overseeing the terms of Elias's remaining debt, refusing any suggestion that it simply be forgiven, and Elias had respected that refusal, understanding it as Dante's own quiet way of maintaining some sense of order in a situation that had otherwise slipped entirely outside his control. It had taken nearly a year of careful, hard-won trust before Dante allowed Elias and Vittoria to see each other openly, without the shadow of secrecy hanging over every meeting. Even then, Dante had made his continued wariness clear in ways both subtle and direct, appearing unannounced at the bakery more than once during its early days, watching Elias work with the same sharp, assessing gaze he had used the very first night they met, as though still searching for some flaw he had somehow overlooked. There had been difficult stretches during that first year, moments when it seemed the fragile trust they had built might collapse entirely. Gregory Voss and his rivals had grown bolder for a time, testing the edges of Marchetti territory more aggressively, as word spread that Dante's attention had shifted somewhat away from business and toward his daughter's well-being. There had been tense weeks when Dante disappeared from the estate entirely, consumed by matters Elias was never told the details of, weeks when Vittoria grew quiet and worried, watching the front gate for her father's return, with an anxiety that reminded Elias uncomfortably of the frightened, silent girl she had once been. But Dante had returned each time, tired but unharmed, and slowly, gradually, the threat from Voss's family had faded into something manageable rather than urgent, leaving the household to settle into a steadier, calmer rhythm than it had known in years. Rebuilding the bakery itself had taken months of careful work, much of it done by Elias's own two hands, late into the night after his debt was finally declared settled. He had scraped together what little savings remained, supplemented by the quiet, unacknowledged help Dante arranged through old contacts and favors owed, and slowly, the shop had transformed from a struggling, half-empty storefront into something that finally felt worthy of his father's memory. Grace had stayed on through it all, her patience and loyalty rewarded eventually with a proper wage and a genuine partnership in the business, something Elias made sure to formalize the moment he was financially able to. But something had shifted permanently in Dante that night. Vittoria first spoke aloud after 2 years of silence, and though his protectiveness never fully disappeared, it slowly transformed into something closer to genuine trust, rather than fear disguised as control. He had quietly used his influence to help Elias rebuild the bakery once the debt was finally settled, never acknowledging the gesture directly, simply ensuring that certain suppliers who had once refused to work with Elias suddenly found reasons to return, and that the landlord who had once threatened impossible rent increases suddenly discovered he had been mistaken about the necessary adjustments after all. Elias had thanked him once, carefully, for the help. Dante had waved the gesture away with visible discomfort, muttering something about simply correcting a mistake he regretted making in the first place, and neither of them had spoken of it again. Vittoria's own transformation over those 2 years had been the most remarkable thing Elias had witnessed in his entire life. Her voice, rough and uncertain at first, had grown steadier with practice, though she still preferred silence in unfamiliar company, more comfortable letting her drawings speak when strangers were involved. Around Elias, around the small circle of people who had earned her trust over time, she had become talkative in a way that sometimes made Elias laugh out loud, teasing him relentlessly about his cooking mishaps, arguing passionately about which of her paintings deserved better placement in the shop window, filling the bakery with a warmth and noise it had never carried during the quiet, lonely years after his father's passing. She had begun studying art formally as well, taking classes twice a week at a small studio across the city, something Dante had resisted initially, before eventually relenting, watching with visible pride as his daughter's paintings began appearing in small local exhibitions, each one selling faster than the last. The quiet, watchful girl who had once been managed and protected into near invisibility had grown into someone entirely her own, sharp-witted and stubborn, and unmistakably present in every room she entered. She had also, over the past year, begun rebuilding relationships with people beyond the walls of her father's estate, something that would have seemed impossible during the years of her silence. She had reconnected with a cousin she had not spoken to since her mother's funeral, exchanged letters with a childhood friend who had long since given up hope of hearing from her again, and even begun mentoring a younger girl at her art studio who reminded her, she confided quietly to Elias one evening, of herself before everything had gone quiet inside her. Watching Vittoria step so fully back into the world, gathering pieces of a life that grief and overprotection had once stripped away from her, was, for Elias, more satisfying than any success his bakery had achieved. Even Colleen, who still ran the Marchetti kitchen with the same sharp efficiency as always, had grown fond of visiting the bakery on her rare afternoons off, sitting quietly in the corner with a cup of tea, watching the easy warmth between Elias and Vittoria, with an expression that looked suspiciously like pride, though she would never have admitted to something so soft aloud. "My father's coming by today," Vittoria mentioned casually, popping one of the slightly burnt cookies into her mouth without hesitation. "He wants to see the new display before it opens properly this weekend." Elias felt the familiar flicker of nervousness that still accompanied any mention of Dante's visits, though it had faded considerably over the past 2 years, replaced mostly by a cautious, hard-earned comfort. "Is he still pretending he doesn't like my bread?" he asked, only half joking. "He ate 4 pieces last time and complained the entire way through," Vittoria said, grinning. "I think that's as close to approval as you're going to get from him." They spent the rest of the afternoon working side by side, Elias managing the steady flow of customers, while Vittoria rearranged her paintings near the window, occasionally calling out playful criticism about the state of his flower supply or the crooked angle of a shelf he had been meaning to fix for weeks. It was an easy, comfortable rhythm they had built together, one neither of them had imagined possible during those first frightened, secretive weeks in the Marchetti kitchen. Dante arrived just as the afternoon light began slanting gold through the bakery's front window, dressed as impeccably as ever, though something in his posture had softened considerably since the tense, controlled man Elias had first encountered 2 years earlier. He paused at the doorway, taking in the warm, busy scene inside, the smell of fresh bread mixing with the quiet chatter of customers admiring his daughter's paintings, and something almost like contentment crossed his usually guarded face. "The bread still smells burnt," Dante said by way of greeting, though there was no real edge behind the words anymore, only the familiar rhythm of an old joke between them. "It's a signature style," Elias said, sliding a fresh loaf across the counter toward him anyway. "You always come back for more." Dante accepted the bread with a faint, reluctant smile, settling into a chair near the window where he could watch his daughter finish arranging her latest painting, a bright, detailed piece capturing the exact moment sunlight hit the bakery's front window each afternoon, something she had been sketching in small pieces for weeks before finally committing it to canvas. It was watching this quiet, ordinary scene, so far removed from the chaos of that first disastrous night, that something unexpected happened. Vittoria, adjusting the frame of her painting slightly, knocked loose a small stack of extra flour sacks Elias had carelessly left too close to the display shelf. The sacks tumbled to the floor in a soft, powdery explosion, sending a cloud of flour into the air and dusting both Vittoria and the freshly hung painting in a fine white coating. For one frozen second, Elias felt an old, familiar panic rise in his chest, some deep instinct still bracing for disaster whenever anything in a kitchen went even slightly wrong. He glanced instinctively toward Dante, half expecting to see the same cold fury that had once filled the Marchetti kitchen after the fire. Instead, Vittoria, standing amid the drifting flour with a shocked expression on her powdered face, looked down at herself, looked at the ruined arrangement of her painting display, and burst into loud, unrestrained laughter. It was not the careful, quiet, almost smile Elias remembered from their earliest encounters. It was full, genuine, uncontainable laughter, the kind that came from somewhere deep and unguarded, the kind that filled the entire bakery and drew smiles from every customer nearby. She laughed so hard she had to lean against the counter for support, flour still drifting from her hair, tears of amusement gathering at the corners of her eyes. Dante rose slowly from his chair, staring at his daughter with an expression Elias had never seen on his face before, something between disbelief and overwhelming, wordless emotion. He remembered, Elias realized, watching Dante's face carefully. He remembered the exact kitchen where this had all started, remembered the wreckage, the broken table, the silent, watchful girl who had not laughed, had not spoken, had barely reacted to anything at all in the 2 years before Elias stumbled clumsily into her life. Now she stood before her father, covered in flour, laughing loud enough to fill the entire room, utterly transformed from the silent shadow she had once been. 2 years, Dante said quietly, almost to himself, his voice thick with something he did not try to hide. It has been 2 years since I have heard her laugh like that. Elias crossed the room and helped Vittoria brush the flour from her shoulders, unable to keep the wide, helpless grin from spreading across his own face as her laughter continued, bright and unstoppable. I think, he said, glancing toward Dante, the wreck was worth it after all. Dante's eyes remained fixed on his daughter, still laughing, still glowing with an ease and freedom that had once seemed impossible to imagine within his careful, controlled world. Slowly, almost reluctantly, something shifted in his own expression, the the guarded tension he had carried for so long finally loosening, just slightly, just enough. Perhaps, Dante admitted quietly, watching his daughter reach for another handful of flour to playfully toss at Elias in retaliation for his earlier joke, her laughter ringing bright and unguarded through the small, warm bakery. Perhaps it was. The afternoon light continued slanting gold through the windows, catching the drifting flour like something almost magical, and for the first time since his wife's death, Dante Marchetti allowed himself simply to stand and watch, without controlling, without managing, without fear, as his daughter's laughter filled the space that silence had occupied for far too long. Elias, covered now in flour himself, caught Vittoria's eye across the small, chaotic bakery, and understood, without needing a single word between them, that whatever storms still waited somewhere ahead, they would face them exactly like this, together, unguarded and unafraid. Later that evening, after the last customers had gone, and Dante had finally taken his leave, with a rare, genuine warmth in his goodbye, Elias and Vittoria sat together on the front step of the bakery, watching the street settle into its quiet evening rhythm. Flour still clung faintly to her hair, and she brushed at it absently, laughing softly at the memory of Dante's stunned expression when her laughter had first filled the room. "He looked like he'd seen a ghost," she said, shaking her head. "He looked like he'd gotten his daughter back," Elias corrected gently. Vittoria was quiet for a moment, considering that, before leaning her head against his shoulder, the gesture easy and familiar now, in a way that still occasionally struck Elias as something close to miraculous, given how far they had both traveled to arrive at this simple, ordinary moment. "I used to think the silence was the only safe place left for me," she said quietly. "After my mother died, it felt like the one thing no one could take from me, or twist into something else. But it was also the loneliest place I have ever been." "You're not there anymore," Elias said. "No," she agreed, a small smile returning to her face as she looked back toward the bakery, its windows glowing warm against the darkening street, flour dust still faintly visible on the floor inside. "I'm not." They sat together a while longer, saying little else, needing little else. Two people who had found their way to each other through wreckage and silence and slow, patient trust, watching the evening settle gently over the street exactly the way it had every evening since, and exactly the way it would, they both quietly believed, for a very long time to come.